Hi, everyone. I was recently asked to opine upon what is the law of tithing, and I'm going to do that. I'm also going to do an analysis. Do the Gentiles have to tithe? I'll start there actually because it's important, and then we'll get into some of the general overview of what is the tithe. I have another article online that's in detail, but we'll cover it adequately here, and you can get the big picture. Okay, so I'm going to review my article online and kind of explain it, and I think that often helps. So the title of the article is "Do Gentile Christians Have to Tithe?" And so I refer to the famous guilt passage, which is aimed at is aimed at self-seeking preachers, not Gentiles. So this is a mistake in how the preachers use it against us when this verse actually in context was about them, the Levites, who were acting as leaders of the congregation and then taking more than they should, and they were the ones who God was angry with, not the people. Many a leader in church today tries to exhort payments to his church by means of Malachi. We have all heard it. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring you all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, says the Lord of hosts, if it will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Malachi 3, verses 9 to 10. Is this ethical, the way it's used on the Gentile congregations, or is this a self-serving guilt thrown on a congregant? The way it is used today, it is largely unethical, self-serving preaching, and it contradicts Malachi in context. Here's why. Let's begin with Malachi. The prophet encourages us to actually remember what the law given Moses says. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Malachi 4, verse 4. By the way, that's only about just a few verses later. Malachi 3, 9, and 10 are just a few verses before that passage. So most leaders in church today ignore every other doctrine than tithing, saying that the law has faded away, was nailed to a tree, fulfilled in Christ. We've heard it all. It's all the verses from Paul. What they ignore is that the tithe under the law is to benefit the Gentile, which the law identified as sojourners, as well as orphans. Who else? The fatherless. Well, the orphans are fatherless, the poor, oppressed, and not only the Levites. Deuteronomy 26, verses 11 to 13, quoted below. So we'll go through it. However, in Malachi, the Levites were taking all the tithe and not properly sharing it with the sojourners, the orphan, the fatherless, and the poor oppressed. This is what immediately precedes Malachi 3, 9 to 10. Do you know that it wasn't about you, these people sitting in the pew? It was the people standing up front. That was the kind of person who was this was aimed at. They were taking everything. All the offerings go to them, the leaders of the congregation, but the people weren't getting anything. So they'd give and they got nothing back. It was all just consumption by the leaders, by the what we would call today our minister class. And that explains who is robbing whom. First, the Levites, the temple leaders, are lambasted in verse 3 and says the, quote, sons of Levi must be purified. So that he's naming them, calling them out by name and class. So the evil you to whom Malachi is speaking is the Levites. This becomes clear when the following list of those who are being denied God's righteous protection are listed, but it omits the Levites. So God's going to say, hey, here's who you're robbing. And he leaves out the Levites as being robbed. So somebody, the only person who could be that God's talking about are the Levites, are the robbers. Here's Malachi 3, verse 5. Then I will draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, against those who swear falsely, against those who oppress the hired worker in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, against those who thrust aside the sojourner, and do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. Malachi 3, verse 5. So this is the identical context. The people who are being victimized are, let's go through the list here. The widow. The only thing that's being omitted is the orphans. Widows, fatherless. There's the orphan, and the sojourner. And then the Levites are omitted. So that's the group that's doing the oppression. So the ones robbing God were robbing the tithe's beneficiaries other than the Levites. The widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, and the poor, spoken about being oppressed of his wages. Okay, so you could even say the poor there. Okay. All these categories appear in the law given Moses as the aim of what's called the triennial tithe, as we will show below. Every 3 years, the tithe would be aimed just for the poor, and it would not be a general tithe. So there was a three-year cycles, and every 3 years, the poor tithe was included as one of the three. We'll get to that later. These are the ones who were denied the tithe in Malachi 3:9-10, and thereby God was robbed of his tithe. He wants it, so it will go to the fatherless, the widow, the Gentile sojourner, and the orphan, if I didn't mention that already. The only one not being robbed were the Levites, and are not mentioned in Malachi 3, verse 5, as victims of the unrighteousness that God's so angry about. It is obvious in context that it's the Levites who were the robbers, who in verse 3 must be purified for their evil robbing of the tithe from the intended beneficiaries, which are those listed in verse 5, which omits themselves. So they are the thieves and the robbers, the priests running the show. All right, so that's enough of that. So Gentiles are actually a beneficiary of it, and they are not in the class that have to do it. That just starts off the top. The limited scope of tithe. The tithe was 10% of one's agricultural produce, the herd, and your flock. Quote, and this is Leviticus 27, verses 30-32. Every tithe of the land, tithe means tenth, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. And every tithe of herds and flocks, every 10th animal of all that pass under the herdsman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. So I think it's easy to say 10% of all the fruits, fruit trees, all of the seed of the land, anything that's growing in the crops in the fields. Okay, so 10% of your agricultural produce. Then it's every tithe, and this is important. It's every. The word every means every 10th of the herds and flocks. So if you only have 9 animals, the rule was, there's a special statute on it, it would be 9 go under, and if there's no more, you don't have to pay a tenth. You have to have at least 10 animals to have a tenth. And then the 10th one is given as to the poor, and the tithing. It goes into the tithing system. Okay, it was not a tithe on income. So this was never on money, never on your earnings. So anybody who's told you pay your tithes and offerings are lying, because that's the wrong use of the word tithe. It meant tithe on agricultural produce, animal stock, and herds. Okay, not anything on the people who had money in their pocket. Why is that? Why do you think that is? Because in that class of people, the wealthiest people had land. And then, frankly, anybody who has land in the world today is much better off than anyone who doesn't have land, because the people with land can afford to share some of their crops, because there's always leftovers. So obviously, God is allocating it from those who can most afford the payment, most afford the extraction of wealth, and can do it with something that you barely notice. 10% of your crops going off to the poor people, or you'll see, that's only 1 out of the 3 years that the poor get it. The other 2 years, you get to eat it yourself in a party at Jerusalem. So I'll give you a preview there. That's how the tithe works. So anyway, let's keep going. So on this whole issue of income, but only on one's produce from the land, whether from the seed in the ground, the fruits of the trees, or animals born on the land. See Deuteronomy 26 below, and we'll get into it. In fact, it was illegal to sell the produce and bring money instead. So if you try to bring cash here, no, we will not even allow you to do that, because you could end up having someone who was a wage earner coming in and trying to hand you cash, and you're supposed to say no. That would help protect them. And so they wouldn't even take cash from anybody. And that was a law, Leviticus 27:28. So don't give me cash. So by definition, by that statute alone, you can't even give cash out of your pocket. You would literally have to go buy some fruit and vegetables and then try to donate those, and maybe the Levitical priest will let you donate the food produce you want to bring. But otherwise, you made a living by wages. You do not pay any tithe. Now, there was a special exception, but you had to prove this. If you were a long, long way from Jerusalem, you could sell your produce and bring money instead. And obviously, I'm going to make a bet you had to sell it through the Levitical priest, because they want to make sure no one's coming into this system who's a wage earner. We want to exclude them from having any sense of obligation, and we're only going to have people who qualify and have to come in, prove that they have a long journey to Jerusalem. They have to make a special exchange. Here's the food and produce. and the priest would give him the cash for it, and then that would be equal, and there would be no violation of the other statute that there was to be no cash given. So see how God protected the sojourners and the hard laborers and workers. They would never have to pay this thing, and that is a brilliant system. Do you see the beautiful love of our Lord? And by the way, think of any government in the world that ever would design a structure that would prevent poor people, prevent hard laborers from having to pay taxes, basically, for support of the poor and the needy. Even though support of the poor and needy is very important, but you know what? So is the hard labor of all those people out there in the fields working their butts off or doing a heavy job, whatever. God protected them too. Hence, the second reason to know the tithe was never on money earned was because it was illegal generally to convert it into money. Okay, I just mentioned that. Hence, it was solely on agricultural produce or farm animals. As a result, the tithe never fell upon anyone who had no land or farm animals, whether Israelite or Gentile. So this wasn't just a special protection for the poor Gentiles. Israelites got this benefit. It was, in a sense, a tax on the farm produce of better-off citizens, like our modern progressive income tax. So there was a sense of fairness involved here. All right, so now I'm going to pause this and put this on another slide. Okay, so was the command on Israelites only or upon Gentiles too? Did it fall on... Oh, wait, is this working? Oh, I hope so. Did it fall on the Gentiles who had land or farm animals? No. As far as I can tell, the answer is no. The duty was exclusively upon Israelites, and you'll see what the evidence is. And so maybe you might disagree. This is one of those where... yeah, it doesn't seem to apply, but now they have land. Maybe they should have to pay these things. So, but let's read it. And what do you think? It seems, and it begins in Deuteronomy 26, and as it progresses, it is decisively only upon Israelites. So it gets clearer and clearer. So here's how it reads in the first two verses of Deuteronomy 26. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance and have taken possession of it and live in it, sounds a lot like sons of Israel. You shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from your land, that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall put it in a basket, and you shall go to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name to dwell there. I'm just going to say this, is if in theory Gentiles were allowed to inherit land, it's clear they can move into whatever tribe they want. There's a passage in Ezekiel. But it is not 100% clear to me that your family can inherit the land. And that seems to be the predicate of why you would be subject to the tithe. Again, just, these are things that lawyers, I'm sure in those years back then, they had to figure this all out. So I'm unclear what would happen. Verses 5 to 11 make it quite clear that we are only talking about Israelites who were brought out of Egypt, who are subject to the command. Okay, I'm going to take a break right here. Okay, so verses 5 to 11 make it quite clear that we are only talking about Israelites who were brought out of Egypt who are subject to the command. Quote, and you shall make response before the Lord your God, a wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. So that clearly seems to be talking about the Israelite people as slaves of the Egyptians. Verse 8, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with great deeds of terror, with signs and wonders, and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And behold, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given me. So that, again, seems to point that this promise of the 10% is based on their having, it's a response to God's having done all these deeds of freeing them from Egypt. Furthermore, one of the objects of the tithe were Gentiles, whether poor or not. Hence, this makes it nonsensical to put the tithe as an obligation upon Gentiles. This was known as the triennial tithe we're talking about. This is the tithe that was spoken about in Malachi. The preachers, Levites, were robbing God of his tithe that went to the fatherless, the widow, the sojourner, and the poor. See Malachi 3, verse 5, quoted above. So this seems to be, we're talking about the poor tithe in particular, is exclusively on the sons of Israel and has these beneficiaries. So it could be different in the other 2 years, but the other 2 years are kind of irrelevant because you get to eat your own tithe. You bring it to the temple and you enjoy it in a party. So the most important one to understand who's paying what is the poor tithe, because that goes from you to somebody else actually. Okay, so I'm going to pause this slide, or stop this slide, and we'll go to another one. Okay, so now I'm going to start by explaining the third year tithe, because if you don't know about the third year tithe, then you make a mistake and you might even think there's two tithes. So you have to understand there's a cycle of tithing is every 3 years, and then in one of those 3 years is the poor tithe. It's also called the poor tithe. So every third year, the tithe went to widows, orphans, the poor, Gentiles, who are called sojourners, and Levites. And Levites today don't exist anymore, so we don't really have to think about an obligation to them at this time. Although some people claim the pastors or the ministers should be treated as the Levites. But that's not true. The Levites were part of the poor tithe for a good reason. They were denied the right to own property. So if you don't have a right to own property, then that was the exchange there was everybody who paid the tithe would every third year would give a portion of it to the Levites. So scholars sometimes call it the poor tithe, but that is actually not its biblical name. But we'll go with that too, because it helps remember there's a 3 year cycle, and 1 year is the poor tithe. So this aspect of the tithe rule is in Deuteronomy 26:11-13. Verse 11, and you shall rejoice in all the good that the Lord your God has given to you and to your house, you and the Levite and the sojourner who is among you. When you have finished paying all the tithe of your produce in the third year, which is the year of tithing, give it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your towns and be filled. So the tithe in this instance will not leave the town. It will not go to Jerusalem, unlike the other 2 years. We'll show you. Then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the sacred portion out of my house, sacred. And moreover, I have given it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to your commandment that you have commanded me. I have not transgressed any of your commandments, nor have I forgotten thee. Now you have to understand that when the commandment was that the tithe would be physically delivered to the Levite. And sometimes people read those commands and think that the poor tithe only went to the Levites. No, he was just the person who would receive it and then would have to distribute it to the categories of sojourner, fatherless, and widow, and do it fairly and only take an appropriate portion, probably 1/4 or something of it. Okay, I'm going to stop this slide and we're going to do another one. All right, so let's ask the question. If the Levites are gone now, does a preacher to Israelite Christians have a right to the tithe, assuming you wanted to pay it? So what if a preacher teaches an Israelite Christian who is the only one subject to a tithe to pay a tithe? Because, right, you can't ask the Gentile to pay it because he was never owed it in the first place. What is the scope of the tithe today to whom it properly applies? First, the tithe was never for temple building upkeep or the financing of a building purchase. Okay, so there's a problem there. We give money to the church for its other projects, which is well and good, but we're talking about what's my legal obligation. So it wouldn't include paying for things like that. Every third year it went not only to the poor and Gentiles as listed above, but also to the tribe of Levi. So what I think is the right thing to do there, the tribe of Levi were getting the tithes because they were not allowed to own property. But most of our pastors get paid a pretty big salary, and the Levites didn't have any salary. Okay, so all they lived on was this money. So I have a feeling you could cross off pastors because they're getting paid a salary anyway. But is that even right? So I think a salary is wrong. It's morally violative of Jesus' command. So if we were to get rid of salaries for pastors and they have to completely be volunteers, then they would live on charity. They would live on the poor tithe every third year. Okay, so the tithe was not payable at the temple, but had to be collected within the gates of each city. This is the poor tithe, and distributed there. This is why the third year tithe continues as an obligation upon Jewish Christians. And let me read this again here. This is Deuteronomy 14, verses 28-29. At the end of every 3 years you shall bring all the tithe of your increase in the same year and shall store it within your gates. So this is not going to Jerusalem. Notice the difference. You'll see later. The regular tithe, the other 2 years, goes to Jerusalem with you in a party. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the foreigner living among you, and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates shall come and shall eat and be satisfied. that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the work you have had your hand to do. See how wonderful God is? But so again, and the question has to be naturally asked, why were Levites included as co-beneficiaries of the third year tithe? Why are they treated this way, given its special status? I think I've already given you hints. They don't have a salary. They live off the poor tithe. They have no land. So it kind of makes perfect sense. But anyway, let's just read. God's going to actually say it too. Verse 29 explains that it is because the Levite has no portion nor inheritance with you. So they don't have any land. They have no portion of the land. They have no inheritance of the land. They totally depend upon God. Well, then I'm going to answer it. So what does this mean? The law provided they were never to own any land, had no inheritance with Israel, so on. It was their participation in the tithe as a beneficiary every third year is how they lived. That was their only compensation. It was their compensation for their temple service year-round, year after year. We read in Numbers 18, verses 20 to 21. To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance. That doesn't mean they get all of it. It just means that every tithe, they have a portion for an inheritance in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting. And the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel. This third year tithe did not mean the Levite could take the entire tithe that year, which the law authorized them to collect. Likewise, the first and second year tithes they collected, but the tither was only encouraged not to forget the Levite when the tithe in years 1 and 2 of the triennial tithe were enjoyed in a party at Jerusalem by the tither. Thus, we cannot confuse temple service of the Levites with money for the temple upkeep itself. The tithe was not supposed to go to what we today call the church. It went to the individuals in certain groups, orphans, widows, Gentiles, called sojourners, the poor, and the Levites. Second, in whether to give a preacher money as a tithe, I must be cautious because in Malachi's day the Levites took it all and robbed God of the tithe owed the widows, the fatherless, the sojourner, and the poor. This is what Malachi 3:9 verses 9 and 10 was all about. I must be sure the money that represents the tithe goes exclusively to the latter and not to the preacher. And the preacher can only get it if he's not getting paid a salary, is my current view on this. So as an Israelite Christian, if I were one, I would have to seriously wonder whether to pay a non-Levite preacher who asks for money to support himself. What should I do? Should I analogize him to a Levite and pay him for his preaching service as a tithe? I say no. Let's listen to Jesus, for Jesus teaches in Matthew 10, verses 7 to 10, that a preacher can only be supported by the law of hospitality. From Leviticus 25, verse 6, discussed this link. The preacher must seek out a house of a worthy person to live in and do the chores of cleaning, farm work to earn his keep while under another's roof. Leviticus 25:6. This is the passage in the law to which Jesus clearly alludes. Otherwise, as a preacher, I must take no wage for preaching. So this is Jesus in, I think it's chapter 10, verse 7. And this is from the original Gospel of Matthew. So this is the Hebrew version of it in translation. And as you go, preach, saying, turn, turn, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. Do not take wages. Freely you receive, freely give. For you received for nothing, and for nothing you shall give. Possess neither gold, nor silver, nor money in your money belts. Neither pack for your journey a change of clothes, nor shoes, nor staff in your hand. For the workman is worthy to receive enough for his food. And that's a quote of, that is a paraphrase of Leviticus 25:6. Or the principles of hospitality in the book of Leviticus. And into whatever city or region you shall enter, ask who is good and honorable among them, and there you will live. There you live until you leave. End of quote. Preachers today should seek to support themselves other than by taking pay from their congregants. If someone wishes to pay them for their sermons as a publishing project, that is okay. Or they can get a normal job. That is obviously okay. But they should never ask or take money from their congregants for themselves. Jesus forbids it. Their pay is only for a workman worthy of his wage, from one whose household the preacher supports by actual service. So if I were a Jewish Christian, I would continue the third year tithe and not regard the preacher as a Levite. I would also doubt I must hold festivals in Jerusalem in years 1 and 2 that depended in their commands on the existence of the temple. The wording of the third year tithe command in Deuteronomy 14, verses 28 to 29 did not depend upon the temple at all, as the tithe was collected and distributed completely within the gates of each city where everyone lived. Hence, it alone clearly continues despite the destruction of the temple, and it only applies to sons of Israel. Okay, I'll stop this slide at this point. Okay, so finally, when does a tithe apply other than the triennial tithe? And we'll find out no one has a share anyway other than the tither. So this basically, when you don't pay your tithe on the second and third year, it doesn't bring your produce to Jerusalem, it doesn't affect anybody. Nobody loses out on anything. So this is why we could still keep always the triennial tithe, because that goes to other people if we had land property. The other 2 years are actually temple dependent. So that's just another factor that these may be impossible to comply with. But anyway, here's what it was. Here is what Deuteronomy 14 verses 26 to 29 says about the first 2 years of the 3-year cycle of tithes, and then the triennial tithe. So this is all in one place. All three are mentioned. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and rejoice, you and your household, and you shall not neglect the Levite, who is within your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. So in other words, when you're going in to do this party with your family and everybody, you should always make sure the Levite is invited to your table to share. So it's a special time for him to share with you. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your town. So this is not brought to Jerusalem. This is brought to your town, and that's every 3 years. This is the third year tithe. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your town, shall come and eat and be filled, that your Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. So again, you can see what the poor tithe is all about, helping the sojourner, that's a Gentile, the fatherless, the widow in your towns. And the Levite could also share. So again, the preachers must preach that in years 1 and 2, the tithe is solely for a party of tithers, and they should, if anything. Okay, so if you wanted to do it, try to recreate it, you could theoretically recreate it at your church, but it's not in particular for anybody but the people who brought the food themselves. They can have a potluck party. Of course, being generous, everybody should share with everybody and invite as many people who are not members of the church to attend and enjoy the same feast. Okay, since there are no Levites anymore, who the law denied land ownership, thus justifying the receipt of the tithe, that aspect of the tithe command seems to be no longer an issue. You really have to have people who are not entitled to have any land and serve without pay, normally. The modern-day preacher has no right to any of the first and second year tithe, obviously, nor the third. So I think that's the correct answer. Only the law of hospitality can be invoked by a preacher as a right to sustain himself by a wage for the value of the work he performs in someone's house in which he boards, or to whom he otherwise provides home upkeep services. That's the law of hospitality, by the way. The preacher has no greater position than any of his congregants, just as Jesus intended in Matthew 10. Conclusion. The way Malachi is quoted to congregants by many modern-day preachers is unethical. It is typically self-serving. It seeks money given to a church with which the preacher runs. It runs a fixed wage. It funds a fixed wage to the leader. This contradicts Jesus' words. It contradicts also the law of tithing. It's a misuse of every conceivable way of misusing the tithe. The preacher also typically does not explain that the tithe is nothing more than a tithe on produce or animals on the land, nor does the preacher teach today that the tithe only applies to Israelites and not upon Gentiles. The truth would gut the entire aim of the preacher to gain money for his own self-support, in violation of every part of the sanctity of the holy tithe. It's not for the preacher who's on a paid salary. And Jesus says it's not for a preacher at all. He has to go work for his living. He has to basically use the law of hospitality and seek help that way. Now, it doesn't mean people can't help him anyway, but he's not allowed to expect it. Nor is it explained by preachers that the food or proceeds of the tithe would go today exclusively back to the tither in years 1 and 2. Nor is it explained that it must be shared only in year 3 among Gentiles, orphans, and widows, and no one else, as Levites are no more. The tithe law barely has only a single application today, except to an Israelite Christian who has land with crops and animals, and the beneficiaries are himself in years 1 and 2, and then and no more Levite because they're gone, and then in year 3, the orphans, the widows, and the Gentiles. As a result, the use of Malachi with Gentiles is an unethical use of the law to make one of the law's true intended recipients of the tithe to feel guilty that instead he or she must comply with the tithe. And then this wrong is aggravated by not telling such a Gentile that the tithe is supposed to return to the tither in a festival under the law for years 1 and 2 of the 3-year tithe cycle. Typically, the one delivering this message has a self-interested agenda that the money end up in his pocket. This is exactly what was happening in Malachi 3, verses 9 to 10. The leaders at the temple, the Levites, were robbing Gentiles, orphans, and widows of what belonged to them under the law of the tithe. And in doing so, the religious leaders who collected the tithe only for their own benefit robbed God, who had commanded how to distribute such a tithe. Seems things never seem to change, does it? Okay, God bless. Hope this helped everybody. Ciao. Bye.